Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining another Mathematic webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for the organization. If you're not familiar with us, we're a membership-based trade association for the medical device industry, primarily in New England, and we work to bolster the industry through education, events like this, collaboration, advocacy, and awareness. I'm really pleased to bring you today's webinar, Turning User Insights into Tangible Product Requirements, brought to you today by our friends at Battelle. I have a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to our panelists. We are going to allocate time for Q&A, so as those questions occur to you, please put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to get to all of those questions. This webinar is also being recorded, so everyone who registered for the webinar will get a copy of that, as well as a modified version of the slides. So stay tuned for that email to come after the webinar. With that, I am pleased to turn it over to Chelsea Fuller, who's going to kick off today's conversation from Battelle. Chelsea.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. Good morning and good afternoon and potentially good evening to all of you on the call today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to kick us off by just going through a brief agenda. Then I'll introduce myself and my colleague, Michael, who are here to talk to you today. So like I said, we'll go through some introductions here in a moment. The objective of what we're going to walk you through, the hope of thinking about device design and roles and responsibilities. There's certainly some nuance we'll discuss. We'll talk a little bit about the process, which is really where you transition those insights from user needs and market requirements into product requirements. We'll lay this out in the format of a medical device development model that we use quite frequently at Battelle. It's the V model, acknowledging that there are others, but this is kind of the one that you'll hear a little bit more about today. We'll talk more about generating and documenting user needs and marketing requirements. Then we'll transition lastly into kind of the structure and way you think about product requirements and how those come from a myriad of different areas, but specifically the user and market requirements. We'll go through a couple of examples and then, like Nicole said, have some Q&A at the end. So again, my name is Chelsea Fuller. I'm a senior product manager at Battelle. I've been at Battelle for about 2 years. Prior to that, I was in commercial medical device product development. I've held a myriad of roles amongst just a few organizations, but those were medical device organizations, and that's really where my background is. I've worked globally for both of those organizations, and I get the pleasure of working specifically with some of Battelle's neurotechnology portfolio right now. I also get the pleasure of helping clients that are working through development activities in collaboration with our researchers and scientists to help formulate what those best product or solutions look like that meet the customer's need. So that's really kind of the role that I play at Battelle right now, and a bit of my background. So I'm going to have Michael introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael Glynn. I'm a principal systems engineer at Battelle. I've been with Battelle for about 5 years now, but I've been in the medical device industry for going on 18 years. I've primarily worked with in vitro diagnostic devices and drug delivery devices, but also a range of other product types over the years. My training is in mechanical engineering, but I have been in a sort of systems role, looking at requirements and risk management and that sort of thing for pretty much my entire career. So I have had a number of years in this area.
Great, thank you, Michael. So just a quick review. We have 2 objectives today. These were obviously what you are here for. Hopefully we can fulfill those. We really want to walk you through the process that we use for capturing insights, how you would gain those, things like market research, user feedback, voice of customers, and considerations of other sources in the day-to-day world of individuals a part of your development team, and how we translate those into actionable market and product requirements. Then learning a little bit about how to leverage both the quantitative and qualitative information to improve the medical device development process. The goal of this is really to understand how to take what you already know, how to supplement with what you need to know, how to apply it to the best process, and ultimately work as a team. On the first slide, I did give you the hint as to one of the major success factors in this entire process, and that really it is a team effort. There are a lot of people involved, and I'll go into that next. So what you see here are a tremendous amount of roles and responsibilities. For the sake of today, I will be playing the product manager or the product owner, and Michael will be the engineer and designer function. Now, that being said, depending on the size of the organization that you're in, whether you're a startup or whether or not you work for a Fortune 50 company, and I can say personally, I've been in both of those, you tend to either wear one specific hat and bring that level of expertise to the table, or you end up wearing a lot of these hats and trying to figure out how to use that hat when you're generating user insights, when you're gathering and collecting market information, and trying to put that into the right words that help get something out the other side, whether that's a product or a solution, whether it's software, something tangible or intangible. So some of the resources that you'll see here, I kind of already described my role, and a little bit of Michael's as well, but there's other subject matter experts that are sometimes really important. In Vatel's world, that includes scientists and researchers, specifically because of the areas of early stage innovation and development that we're especially primed to help clients with. We have a lot of science and research and technology that fuels that. But obviously, if you're in a more established company that has either a strong portfolio or a well-established portfolio or a very broad portfolio of devices, you're going to likely have access to regulatory specialists. Those are people that are well-versed in the complex regulatory landscape governing medical devices, and they're exceptionally important, especially early on. There's a lot of QA and compliance professionals. Those help with generating requirements in the ways of quality standards, safety requirements, and other relevant regulations. The UX and the UX designers, the user experience and the UX designers are also the type of engineers and designers you might consider in the middle bucket, but that strictly are focused on understanding users' needs, behaviors, and preferences. I work with that team a lot, and it's really exciting to be able to think of applying more of their engineering disciplines and experience in design towards what you're creating. A lot of times there's clinical, especially if you're involved in a medical device. Sometimes that's a chief medical officer. Sometimes that's researchers and scientists that we're involved in. Sometimes that's, a doctor coming up with a brilliant idea to solve a problem because they can't find anything in the mass market to solve for it. The manufacturing world is really important, especially when you get to that later stage, especially if there's things like cost of goods or processes that are limits or open for the generation of what your new thing is. So that's a really important lens to have, probably not throughout the entire process, but certainly at key points. Part of your voice of customer isn't just the actual user, but your internal organization as well. And for me, one of my closest end partners and internal customers is our marketing and sales teams. But like I said, the users and patients or ultimate end users of your thing, your device, your software are really going to be ones that provide a tremendous amount of input. So really the collaboration of these stakeholders ensures that your medical device requirements are comprehensive, that they're aligned with regulations, they're user-centric, and that they're technically feasible. You're going to have regular communication with feedback loops, and you'll be collectively inputting information into documentation that's essential throughout this process to really maintain a clear understanding of the requirements and any potential changes that have to be made. So like I said, for the sake of today's conversation, we're going to really focus on the roles that myself would play in the product manager owner realm and the engineering and designer's perspective from Michael's lens. What we wanted to align on was something I mentioned earlier regarding models and tools for development. There are several established models and tools for developing product requirements that really help guide teams through this process. Some are more systematic and structured. Some are a little bit more flexible and, as one is named, even agile. So one of the ones that I wanted to talk through a little bit was the waterfall model. It is a very traditional linear approach where product requirements are gathered and defined in the upfront stage before moving on to design and development and testing. So sometimes this model can be seen as a little less flexible as some other methodologies, but it can be really effective for well-defined projects that have stable requirements. Oftentimes we find this model used in hardware development. The Agile methodology, such as Scrum or Kanban, really emphasize iterative and incremental development. And those product requirements are divided into smaller features or user stories. And so development occurs in short cycles called sprints. So Agile really allows for flexibility, adaptation, and incorporating regular stages of user feedback. So it's actually often used in software development. Some of these other tools like user-centered design, design thinking, requirements engineering, user stories, and use cases are all great tools. You can go out and simply Google them. They have a tremendous amount of depth to them, depending on how they become important to your development process. There's the Moscow method. This categorizes requirements as must have, should have, could have, and won't have. So it's a bit more flexible and very high level, but it does help prioritize features and functionalities based on their importance and impact. A lot of these methodologies can imply the use, deploy the use of lean. Lean is a really effective methodology, especially if you're resource constrained. And as a startup, this is really helpful sometimes because you're thinking about the most important things at the most minimal level. And lastly, the V model. This really emphasizes the relationship between each development phase in medical devices and its corresponding testing phase. So requirements are linked to specific test cases, and they ensure that each requirement is thoroughly tested before moving on. It is why one of the best models that we've used for medical devices are critical because of the FDA requirements. So while each of these models has its own strengths and weaknesses, what's really important is that you choose the model that works best for you and understand that if you're working with an organization like Battelle in order to help support your design, that you take into consideration the knowledge that they might have to be able to adapt to your style or incorporate more aspects of it to make your process more robust. So I want to have Michael focus on this last one. So I'm going to have him dive into that a little further next.
Thanks, Chelsea. So looking at, excuse me, looking a little bit more at the V model, it is a common representation of the development process across many different industries. There are many variants that are used, but at its base level, it boils down to figure out what the product needs to do or be, design something you think does that, and put it together and confirm it does what you thought it needed to do, which is what this simplified representation is trying to show. And so how does that relate to medical device development? Well, as Chelsea mentioned, there is quite a good correlation here between the regulations that we need to follow as medical device developers and the V model. And so this slide here overlays some of the key design control terminology onto the V model. And so you can see, so these are excerpts from 21 CFR 20, the Code of Federal Regulations for Medical Device Development. And you can see the design inputs are represented at the top left of the V. We've got design outputs at the bottom, design verification and validation on the right. And so it's important to understand the context in which these design inputs are being used for medical device development in order to ensure that they're formulated and captured in a way that leads to appropriate designs, and more importantly, to verification and validation and being able to execute that in a successful and timely manner. So just going over each of these in a little bit more detail. So design inputs are defined as ensuring that the design requirements relating to a device are appropriate and address the intended use of the device, including the needs of the user and the patient. And so this is where the user needs at the top level here, and the product requirements, what the device needs to do, are getting captured. Obviously, there needs to be a trace in the requirements management world between these two levels of design inputs. And it's these inputs that inform the design, and that's where you come out with the design outputs, or the drawings, the code, whatever defines your device. And as then when you take that output, you need to verify that each of these product requirements is met by that design output. And you need to show, again, this trace between each product requirement that you define and the testing that you do to verify that that product is meeting those product requirements. That is incredibly important. And means that the how you define your requirements plays a huge impact on how easy it is to get past this stage of the project. Similarly, when we get to design validation, this is ensuring that the device conforms to the user needs. And so there needs to be that trace, so you can show that, yes, this design that we've produced does meet each of these user needs. And so it is very important, again, that these user needs are formulated in a way that allows you to validate them according to these regulations. Another, I guess, consideration in all of this is that it can be easier to think that the cost of change increases at a steady pace as you go through development, representing a growing number of hours that have been devoted to it. However, the reality is that there are inflections and step changes in this curve due to expenses other than direct labor, the implications that medical device regulations have if you experience a failure during verification or validation, and other such things as this. This is obviously a very simplified representation. I'd probably prefer it to be drawn on scrap paper. That's the kind of level of detail this has. But to get the gist, what if you come across a problem in verification, validation, it's a big deal, and it can cost a lot of time and money to rectify that at that point. And so it's recognizing this, and the reason we're talking about this is that if we start from a solid foundation and get solid user needs, solid product requirements, it can really make this back end a lot smoother, and then be much less risk that things will go wrong, and less risk that you'll need to change things at this point in the project, which is obviously undesirable. Okay, let's get rid of that little sketch there. So let's focus in here now on the area that we are looking at today, the design inputs, user needs, and product requirements. That sort of element of the top left of the V diagram, and you, as we can see here from this sort of expanded view, it's more complex than it can appear from that V model. There is a lot of other things that go into this, and a lot of interdependencies. To be honest, this diagram on the right itself is also simplified. I could have put even more detail into it at the risk of confusing everyone. But this is just to try to show that there is a lot of different pieces of work here. So a couple of things to point out here. Usability engineering risk management are two other facets of medical device development that certainly need to be considered and have their own role to play in defining product requirements. But that's not going to be the focus of what we talk about today. But certainly, yeah, definitely need to be considered and do impact impact requirements. Looking up here at that sort of the user needs area, we draw a distinction here between a user needs document, which says, well, what do the users of the system need from this device? At a fundamental level, that will be what we validate when we get to design validation. Distinct from that is the marketing requirements, which may speak to the commercial needs of the device, which can be very important, but may not be as important to regulatory bodies who may not care if you make a profit on your product, but I'm sure you certainly do. So both are very important, but for different reasons. And because of the regulatory implications, there is definitely a need to keep the distinction between the two. And so that's what this is trying to show here, is that there is a distinction. And when we see how that translates down to product requirements, we see that the things that we really truly care about are being validated at a user needs level and then verified at a product requirements level would get captured in this product requirements document, while the things that maybe are more business related, commercial marketing, would potentially be captured as design goals. Now, the distinction between these two can get captured in any number of ways, and I've seen it done many different ways over the years. But the fundamental is that you need to distinguish, here's something that we really need to verify formally is the case with the product, or we cannot release it, versus here's something we really would like to be true, but if it's not met, we can make a business decision that we're still willing to release it. So that's certainly something that needs to be carefully thought about how it's going to be managed in your documentation and in capturing of these requirements. And the third thing I'd just like to highlight here is what I've captured over here is a system architecture. Technically, system architecture is inherently part of design outputs. It is part of design. You are saying how you're going to be building this system, this device. But in my experience, you cannot produce a cohesive set of requirements without understanding that. And so while there is often a feeling of general desire to have product requirements be design agnostic, you can never truly achieve that idealized state of design agnostic, because you need that high-level architecture to inform your requirements. How do you know you need a requirement to heat to 95 degrees if the architecture doesn't say that you need to heat something? Maybe you're going to use a chemical means instead of a heating means to achieve that end. Unless you've decided that, you can't have a requirement to say what needs to do. So there is that sort of ebb and flow between the different facets here. We don't strictly go from left to right along that V model. And that strict waterfall approach isn't typically how it works. It tends to be cyclical in nature. And yes, you need to have that architecture, that high-level design view to feed into these other elements as you're developing your product requirements. So that's sort of a high-level view of the V model. And so with that in mind, and sort of in summarizing here, why we wanted to sort of step back and take that broader look at the process is that while certainly clearly user needs and marketing requirements do feed into product requirements, it is also very useful and helpful, as we say here, to start with the end in mind, and look at what do we need from the product requirements in order to make sure that when we formulate the user needs and marketing requirements, we've got what we need in order to generate those product requirements, and we know what we'll need those to be. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chelsea.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. So just to kind of step back for a second, and mostly to hone in on what Michael said about starting with the end in mind, what this really tells someone in my role in the organization is understand what your internal customers, like your engineers and designers, really need to know, so that you know what you need to know in order to help support what gets fed into that V model or that machine. So if I understand a systems engineer's perspective and influence on writing effective product requirements, then I can go make sure I've talked with customers, generated marketing research, looked at standards and regulations, understood the dynamics of where products and devices might be sold and used to help answer those questions if they come up proactively, rather than going, I don't know the answer to that, let me go back and find that out. And to Michael's point on how the linear versus the step change of the cost and time associated with that, well, let me go back, becomes exceptionally important. So no, by no means do I know what a systems engineering discipline does at a very detailed level, but I can't tell you how many times I still learn something from talking with a lot of our engineers and designers and developers that I may not have necessarily thought of as something to define a requirement about. And when you're in a team and you're very cohesively working through design like this on a day-to-day basis, the expertise starts to translate and to be able to filter across those teams so that the work gets done more effectively. So my encouragement to you throughout this process is to think about, within your organization, how do you align with the intent of this work? Who do you work in partnership really closely with that you may not necessarily think that you could or should? How do you find organizations that can help support that with deep levels of expertise? And not necessarily think about this work by title, perhaps, but by activity, since it can come from any myriad of those individuals that were highlighted in the group of people in that earlier slide. So one of the ways that I wanted to start discussing user needs and insights was how historically I've been able to work with understanding a market or a product's landscape or a clinical space in order to help capture and document user stories and use cases. So historically, in owning a portfolio or simply a product, you're constantly doing annual market research. So sometimes these are customer satisfaction or market share surveys. There are so many things that people will tell you or not tell you within those types of documents that they're providing feedback on. Quarterly business reviews or annual strategy reviews, if you're in a certain business or if you're in a certain segment of a business or in a certain care setting, become really critical, because that's really where information should be summarized in a way that helps inform action moving forward. And that can also be another area where product problems, market needs, user stories come into play when you think about finding areas to enhance or develop something new. Like I said earlier on, I've been in a global capacity for quite a few decades at this point, and a lot of times global meetings and domestic meetings that you're having internally within your organization can be really great. Sometimes the need of an organization in France actually is very similar to the one that might be in the United States or Canada and Mexico. So it's important to know that while there might be borders for which you're able to do business because of other regulations or resource limitations, a lot of times clinical care isn't defined by those same borders. I don't know about you, but industry conferences and trade shows have been one of those things that I have a love-hate relationship with. I learned so much from them, but we all know how burdensome they are sometimes in taking us away from our day-to-day. But every single time I attend one, I always come away with something that helps me understand the market or the landscape, or conversations that I've been able to connect with people, and understanding the opportunities that still exist to solve problems or make something better. So as I'd say gruesome as sometimes those types of places can be from an executionary standpoint, I always find value in them. And I'm secretly glad that we're all kind of getting back to the in-person ones from the virtual ones. Many times social media becomes a really helpful location where people are unfiltered in their way of sharing feedback. So it doesn't hurt to make sure you're connecting with places that your customers or your users are possible venues for them to vent and talk about their experience with your device or within that care setting. I frequently use the MAUDE database. There are a lot of FDA reports. I follow a lot of recalls and regulatory processes to understand which markets are really struggling, which organizations aren't meeting requirements and therefore being pulled from the market. So that in and of itself is actually really helpful. Academia is huge. As you know, there are so many places that are doing research. The NIH is funding more grants this year than last year, and many other organizations within the government are constantly trying to solve the biggest problems. So we're very connected to that as Battelle. And internally, a lot of our professionals in research have come out of academia. And so that process is really helpful to understand what are the most early stage problems that people are thinking about solving in really creative ways. And lastly, and I would say certainly for an organization stepping into, partnering with someone like Battelle, is primary and secondary market research. Sometimes you can go out and hire organizations to do this, but if that research isn't tied into understanding how it's going to be used to fuel the product's requirements, then sometimes there's gaps and you end up having to go back and do it again, or realize that you don't have that information and find another way to go get it. So I would say connecting primary and secondary market research is really essential when it comes to getting voice of the customer that would help with your product's design. I really enjoy capturing user stories, use cases, and user personas because it helps you know who's going to be using your thing or your technology. So the way that I've written out an example here, when you think of the problem that you're going to solve, is what is really their main need and the thing that you must address, and how would it address that issue? So if I were creating a new software that was going to help individuals find a holistic doctor in their city, one of the problems that we would be solving is to allow it to generate an address-based search. So if you define this user need with what your problem to solve is, then that would help you understand what the need is that you could align with the market that they're searching in, and how then that product requirement will be verified that you've done the address-based search as your product requirement. When you write a user story, it's really important to make it impactful. Most of a product owner's responsibilities for selling inside their organization is generating excitement. It's making sure that everyone understands that you're on the same team, that you're aligned toward the same goal, and the impact that you're going to have when you solve that goal. So I usually take the personas that I might generate for who would be using the device and think about what they want and then what they're going to get from that want, because that is really how you're going to intrinsically connect with what you're developing, especially when you're trying to sell on the inside of your organization as to the value for this work. So Michael referred to earlier the differences between a product requirement and a market requirement or marketing requirement. And one of the ways that you can define market requirements is through an MRD. An MRD is a marketing requirements document that outlines a lot of different areas, like a market description. So this is your target market. That could also include your market's category, your market size, your market's share, your key customer segments, the challenges that they're having, primary pain points felt by your customers, those personas. But as you get into the key objective of what you're trying to do, you're also understanding how the competitors are there, what channels you're going to target this device for. Is that going to be home health care? Is it going to be government? Are you going to focus on, VA? Is this going to be direct to patient? Is this going to be through distribution? So you have an understanding of everything within the landscape of where and who you're going to be selling to. Then you can bring in your opportunities and threats. If you haven't, I would strongly recommend generating a SWOT for either your market or your product. Opportunities and threats are the ones that are external to your organization. So the thought is really, if you're capturing this, then you understand where you're primed for success in the market and a threat against your competitor or that threat from a competitor, and where you may or may not want to create or generate product requirements to be different from versus similar to. If you think about customer challenges, this is really what problems you're solving. And a lot of times market requirements really should tie back to use cases. So if you generate great use cases, you may have 6 of them, you may have 60 of them. I would probably recommend closer to 6 than 60. But the more stories that similarly align to how you're going to solve them really helps drive that market's requirement into something that will solve for that user. So one of the Presto documents that's listed on the right here is another document that I encourage you to generate. These are ones that I touch pretty much annually, sometimes every 6 months. It really depends on what's happening, but it allows you to look at the political, the regulatory, the economic, the social, the technology, and then the O is for other landscape that your product or your business is in. And why that's really important is because if there are changes that are happening related to the government's focus, or if there's a regulatory environment or a reimbursement environment, which is usually what my other is, that drives how you need to solve for something, it's really important to be able to point back to where you learned that information. And Michael will talk here in a little bit more about kind of tying those back to things and how you document where you found it. But this is a couple of different ways that you could think about documenting information that you learn about your market, so that when you go to generate requirements against use cases, you have a really strong connection between those two.
Hey.
I was just going to have Michael speak a little bit more in depth about the product requirements. So we've been talking a little bit about user needs. We've been talking about market or marketing requirements, and I'll let Michael continue on with product.
So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on the product requirements front. There is obviously a whole lot of depth you could go into about writing good requirements and making them testable, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm going to keep it fairly high level and try to keep it more at the interface between, Chelsea's role and my role, for example. But just quickly, in terms of why they're important, I mean, I think most people are aware of why requirements are important, but just going over quickly, obviously it does form that basis of alignment between everyone in the organization as to what exactly you are designing. And that is the fundamental, this is what we are designing to, this is what we are designing. And so it's obviously very, very important from that perspective. It does form a focal point for different disciplines as well, so that there's that collaboration of how multidisciplinary features are getting implemented by looking at that all in the same context of the product requirements document. There is certainly an element of risk mitigation, certainly from a safety risk perspective. As I mentioned before, that is something that feeds into the product requirements document. How risk control measures get captured in there typically. Scope management is also similar to alignment, right? You want to know exactly what you are designing and what you are not designing, what's in scope, what's out of scope, and the requirements do tend to form that definition of this is what we need. No less than that, for sure, but typically also no more, given the constraints of schedule and budget which any project has. And then also decision support. So in any development, there's going to be trade-offs that need to be made. We could do this, but that gets worse. So we could do this, but this gets worse. And the requirements allow you to look at the balance of those two things and say, well, we need to make sure these are both at a minimum this. So what does that mean the solution is? And if necessary, it allows a basis for going back and saying, well, we can't meet both of those. What do we do? And that gets back to something that Chelsea mentioned before about documenting the whys. And this is true of both requirements and user needs and marketing requirements for that matter. It's very important to document why you've kept, why is that the requirement? Why is that the need? Where did that come from? What's the source of this requirement need? Because it's if you need to make that trade-off and saying, well, we can't meet this and that, and you need to go back and say, well, is one of our assumptions wrong about what this needs to be, or do we need to start over? If you can go back to, well, we made this requirement because we made this assumption, well, maybe that assumption's wrong. Maybe we can get more data. We can speak to more users. We can do another user study. We could talk to more key opinion leaders in the field to understand, is that truly what is needed? Maybe something different is needed. Maybe the market has shifted, and therefore we've got an avenue to moving forward with the development. So yes, it does provide that sort of framework upon which to make these sorts of trade-off decisions. In terms of how we document it, obviously that there is going to be a product requirements document, although they're called numerous different things, lots of different names. That fundamentally captures the requirements for the product. And quite often they'll be captured in some sort of requirements management system, but that does depend on the complexity of the device that you are developing. Simpler systems might use Excel, and we certainly do that from time to time. But for more complicated systems, when there's a lot of tracing to keep track of, a requirements management system is invaluable in doing that. And so then I just wanted to, if I can get this to move on, to speak to a couple of considerations when formulating requirements. And this is, as I said, from the context of someone who might be in Chelsea's position, feeding it down to someone who might be in my position. There's a level of detail, sort of going back to what I was saying earlier with the V model and how requirements eventually need to be verified. And we need that level of detail to make sure we've got a strong linkage between the two. It's testable. We know that we've definitely met what this thing is. And so you might not be thinking about that, but in my position, I certainly will be. And so when I get requirements such as these, I'll be asking for more detail. The device shall have a turnaround time of 8 hours. That's great. When are we starting that time and when are we ending that time? Depending on the system, that may be more or less obvious, but that is a key detail that we may have different opinions on what that means. And if we want to make sure that we achieve what we think it needs to be, we need to be on the same page about what that is. Similarly, for the next one, the device shall indicate the current battery level to the user. Okay, that's good. In what sort of granularity is that? Is that every 1%, every 10%? Or maybe they just need to know when it's below 20%? Or what does that mean? Again, more detail. And so the reason I say this, if the more detail you have coming in, the less we need to go in circles, right? So think about, how is this going to be implemented, and what details might I need to provide to the engineering team for them to implement this? So that's sort of level of detail. Then in terms of source and justification, I think I already sort of somewhat covered this, but where do the numbers come from? So whenever you put a number in there, it's like, well, where did that come from? Was it, baselining from the predicate device is common. Was it maybe from a voice of customer study? Maybe. Was it from an academic paper? Possibly. Or maybe you talked to this one doctor, let's call him Dr. Jekyll, and he reckoned that it should be this way. Well, I mean, Dr. Jekyll is brilliant and all, but he's only one guy. So maybe that's not the best frame of reference for that requirement or that need, depending on which one we're talking about. And so what I often like to say is it's useful to ask why. When you say this is the need, ask yourself why. And often the answer might actually be the need as one point. But two, if it's not, then that's great to capture as the source or the justification for that need or requirement. So that's often a useful thing to do. And then there are a few words and phrases that I like to avoid for various reasons. So things like minimize and maximize, it sounds good, but how do you prove that you've done that? That's trickier. That's trickier. Minimize. Oh, how small is that? 0.1 minimized? 0.01? I don't know. As expected, well, you might expect it one way. I might expect it another. How do we know that's the same thing? What are we going to test when we say that it needs to perform as expected? I'm not sure. And by the way, these are all examples that I've seen in requirements, and they're not made up. Words like not, never, prevent, again, that the negatives can be tricky, right? Because it's very hard to prove a negative. You'll never see this. Do I need a test forever to prove that I never see it? At what point do I stop my testing program? I think you'll want to release the product at some point. And then the correct use of imperatives like shall, should, and must. So this goes back to what I was saying with product requirements and design goals. Quite often, the convention is to use shall for mandatory product requirements and should for design goals that aren't mandatory, that will not be verified. It's not always the case, but I've seen that probably more often than I've not seen it. But if that sort of convention is used, it's very important to A, define it somewhere, and B, be consistent with its use. Because I have seen requirements documents with a vast array of shall, should, must, can, could, will, won't. It's just all over the place, and it's very hard to be sure what that is trying to imply, if anything, because quite often those are meaningful. So consistency is very helpful there to make sure everyone's on the same page about what that actually means. And so we're just going to look here at some examples of user needs, marketing requirements, and product requirements. These are obviously pretty basic, fluffy examples in a way, but just to give a sense of what we're talking about. Chelsea, did you want to run through those?
Sure. Obviously, it's not easy to necessarily come up with an example that works for everybody, but here's just a few that I've recently deployed with projects that I've worked on. And so in understanding the first one, what we discovered is that when they were using the device, they wanted it to be something they could attend in a local event in public without any disruption. And so really what they wanted it to be based on noise environments that we put in front of them as stimuli during this research was that it was quieter than your average library. Now that's obviously not quantifiable, meaning that's not a number. So that really is just what the need will generate. And what we acknowledged with this device was that it would be sold in a market where reimbursement was tied to a requirement of noise levels. So the market requirement was that in order to sell it in Germany, the device had to be less than 40 decibels to be reimbursable. Now, mind you, not every user need is going to align with a marketing requirement that results in a product requirement. Similarly, you might get a bunch of requirements out of a marketing requirement that ties back to a user need. So these are just a one-to-one relationship, but know that you might end up with 5 or 10 product requirements that could stem from one marketing requirement that could stem from more than one user need. So the way that this product requirement would be written in a best form for someone like Michael is that it emits sound less than 40 decibels at flow setting 2. The next one, and it kind of alludes to one of the examples that Michael was referencing earlier, they wanted something within 8 hours. And when we asked why, what we ultimately came up with was that they wanted the results obtained in 1 lab shift. And so the market requirement for what clinicians were expecting was that results would be delivered to the practitioner in less than 12 hours. So again, that's less than 1 lab shift. We're not talking about the number 8 even in here. But those again were the constraints of the market around expectations. So the products requirement ended up with a turnaround time. So like when you press play to run complete, it will actually deliver it in less than 3 hours because we understand that lab shifts are not always 8 hours. So going back to that user need, they can think that they need it done in 1 lab shift, but 1 lab shift could vary between 2 and 12 hours. The last one's a very common one that probably many people have heard used before. This is, ideally you want something to have an apple look and feel. And that could certainly mean a lot of things. So from a user's perspective, it means it's got rounded edges, maybe it's white, it's got a very clean appearance. But from another lens, it could be how it's used. So this is really a very UX UI driven user need, and the marketing requirement against that one was that it had ease of startup that was intuitive. And what it tied back to in the why was actually a business case. They wanted to allow for easy customer conversion. They understood that if something was simple, like an Apple device, from when you first take it out of the box to when you're first capable of using it, that it was easy to start up, and that would make it something that people would naturally convert to. So they were looking for market adoption from a competitor. So that products requirement that generated out of this was that it would contain no more than 5 screens of setup questions to start up. So those are just a few examples. I hope that this has been helpful. If you think about where and how and who you're connected with to capture user needs, we're always able to answer questions and offer support. Certainly your market and your marketing requirements are something that have a bit more formality in documentation, that we have multiple ways of helping support your ways of putting this into something more quantifiable that ultimately generates really excellent product requirements. And so for the last 5 minutes or so, if there are any questions in the Q&A, Michael and I would be happy to stick around and answer any of those. And I'm not sure if we have any at this point. So I'm going to turn it back over to Nicole to see what she has for us. Thank you very much, everyone, by the way.
Hi again, great presentation. Thank you so much. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We do have one question that came in while you guys were talking. I'll read it and you guys can decide who's best to take it. What type of research tends to yield the best user needs?
I can take that one, Michael. The answer is most types of research. I think depending on what level of product development you're in, are you in an early stage innovation phase, or are you looking at generational improvements? That can really drive the nuances of the types of methods that you might use. Some that come to mind would just be something like secondary research. So that's just, using desk research, that's, books and internet type of things. User interviews are really helpful. I would say surveys and questionnaires to your users, whether you have them already or whether you go out and generate those. I personally am a huge fan of observational and field studies. I think those provide a lot of ethnography and contextual research to the use of your device and the opportunities that exist around it. Usability testing is huge, and one of the areas that Battelle certainly excels at. There's a lot of times you can leverage other organizations or other departments within your organization. Battelle has a tremendous amount of health analytics or data analyses and synthesis teams that we leverage a lot. So that's another really great method for user needs. So I would say probably a combination of put your own eyes on things, whether that be primary or secondary. Discussions with customers and VOC is always where my best user needs come from.
Great. Looks like we do have another question that just came in. Any thoughts on how we as HFE/design professionals can nudge our requirements to be more sustainably focused?
So if we're talking about sustainability from a green maybe lens, social justice-y probably, I would imagine. Michael, do you have any thoughts off the top of your head? Part of what I naturally gravitate towards are things like the requirement would be that you comply with the Green Dot program in Europe. And so sustainability requirements are things that are generated out of what do you have to do to meet that requirement to sell your device or your product in Europe, specifically around packaging, specifically around reusability, how that product is cleaned or reused.
Right. I think it's a matter of making sure that your requirements cover the full life cycle of the device. Making sure it doesn't just cover, well, this is what the device needs to do, but also what's needed from a packaging perspective and from a disposal perspective. As if you don't capture those requirements at all, you're certainly not going to make sure that they're sustainably considered. But if you have sections in your requirements for what are we going to do with disposable, what's the requirement here? Is the requirement that we're not throwing out more than X amount of this in standard waste, and we need some way of recycling components of it? Or that sort of then builds in that mechanism to say, well, hang on, we don't have that at the moment in this device, that's not meeting the requirements, that's unacceptable. So I think it's making sure that you've got those elements captured in the requirement set, and it's cohesive from the full product life cycle. Hopefully that answered the question.
And we have one more question we might have time to answer here. What's the best way to display user data, especially qualitative data?
I probably need a bit more context. If we're thinking about user data as in your device is capturing and generating it, then that could be very much like a push toward a lot of UX and UI work that a human-centered design or a UX or UI designer would want to work with you through. In order to make sure you understand what's really important versus what's not. But I probably need a bit more context as to the ways to display user data. maybe we can take that one offline if someone wanted to send that over to us afterwards, or we could follow up with them one-on-one.
Is there a good email folks can reach out to? Because we do have some other questions coming in, unfortunately, and we're out of time. So if you have any questions, how can you reach Patel?
Absolutely. So at the end of the presentation, there will be a 1-800 number, as well as an email box that we will be monitoring after this webinar. My personal email and Michael's will also be in that deck. But if you just go onto Patel's website, there's a contact us in the right upper hand corner, and it'll get to us, I promise. Of course, there's always LinkedIn if you'd like to connect as well and reach out. We can certainly answer any questions and make sure that we're supporting the needs of others in the business the best we possibly can.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Chelsea and Michael. Great presentation. And that deck that Chelsea mentioned, everyone will receive it who registered for the program, along with the recording after. You'll get it directly via email. So stay tuned for that. Again, thank you to Patel for hosting the webinar today. We can't put on this great content for our members without support for sponsors like you. So really appreciate it. I do encourage you to go to massmedic.com and check out all the other great events we have coming up. And thanks for attending today. We look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.
Bye-bye.